The groom never arrived at the chapel. A passing cowboy took his place. The horse threw a shoe somewhere outside of Cutter's Creek, and that's the only reason I was in that town at all. I'd been riding 3 days with the plan of being somewhere else entirely, a ranch job east of Tucson. A man named Aldrin who'd written that he needed a hand through branding season and was willing to pay fair. I had the letter folded in my breast pocket. I'd read it maybe 4 times, not because the words changed, but because it was something to read and I didn't have much else. That's what the drift does to you after long enough you collect small things. A letter. The way a mountain looks from the north. The name of a man who once bought you a meal in Abilene and didn't ask anything back. 11 years is a long time to be nowhere in particular. The shoe came off clean, not a crack, just pulled free from the clay after the creek crossing. My mare, I called her Seta, short for nothing, just a sound she'd learned to answer to. She wasn't lame, but I wasn't going to push her on hard ground with the front left bare. I walked her the last mile in. The country there was dry and blue-shadowed in the early morning, juniper on the hillsides, and the town when it came up was the color of everything else. Adobe, unpainted wood, a water tower. A feed and grain, a hotel with a porch that needed attention. Found the smithy on the south end of town. Man named Orver, gray-whiskered, worked by himself, didn't talk much. He looked at Seta's foot, said 2 hours. I said I'd be back. I didn't know what Cutter's Creek was doing that morning. Didn't know and didn't particularly care. Towns are towns. They have a saloon and a general store and a hotel if they're prosperous, a church if they've got ambitions, and everybody knows everybody's business except yours. I'd been through 100 of them. You learn to move through a town like water through gravel. You go where you can go, and the rest of it closes back up behind you, and nobody notices you were there. The church was at the north end of the main street. White-painted clapboard, small, with a bell in the tower that somebody had ringed with morning glories, which struck me as optimistic for the time of year. The doors were standing open, and there were people gathered outside in the way people gather when something is happening that they weren't expecting to happen. Men with their hats in their hands, women talking into each other's ears, a preacher in the doorway with his Bible held against his chest. And there was a woman in a wedding dress, sitting on the front step with her hands in her lap. I wasn't going to stop. I kept walking. I had a pocket watch that needed winding, and I needed to find somewhere to wait out the 2 hours, and I wasn't in the habit of inserting myself into situations that weren't mine. That was a rule I'd developed on the drift. Don't insert. Observe and move on. The world has enough men who think they're the solution to somebody else's problem. But she looked up when I passed. Just looked up, and there was nothing needing in the look, nothing that asked for anything. She wasn't crying. She wasn't doing the thing women do when they want to be seen not crying, which is its own kind of performance. Her jaw was set like a woman who'd been told something she already suspected and was now deciding what to do with the information. The dress was white cotton, simple, with a small lace panel at the collar. Her hair was dark and pinned up, and one piece of it had come loose and was hanging alongside her face, and she hadn't bothered to push it back. I kept walking. Got about 20 yards further and stopped. The thing about being nobody in particular, about being the man who drifts through and nobody can quite remember his name afterward, is that you learn to read the air of a place. You learn it fast because sometimes it matters which way the wind is blowing, whose grudge is whose, which men are looking for a reason. The air around that church was the air of a thing gone wrong that everyone could see and nobody knew how to address. People standing in their nice clothes with nowhere to go, looking at everything except the woman on the step. No groom. I turned around. I have thought about why I did that a good many times since, and I still can't tell you it was anything noble. It wasn't pity. She didn't look like she wanted pity. It wasn't that I thought I could fix it, because a man who's been drifting for 11 years knows better than to think he can fix anything. Maybe it was just that I had 2 hours to kill, and that seemed as interesting a way to kill them as any. Maybe it was the set of her jaw. Maybe it was the look that didn't ask for anything. Some things you do and you can explain them, and some things you do and the explanation only comes later, if it comes at all. I walked back up to the step and I took my hat off. She watched me come without moving, without changing her expression. I said, I don't know what's happened here, but if you'd like company while you work it out, I'm handy. She looked at me for what felt like a long while, but was probably 10 seconds, taking account of me, I supposed. What I was, whether I was worth the trouble of responding to. She said, You're not from here. No, ma'am, my horse threw a shoe. I'm just passing through. She looked at the hat in my hands, then back at my face. She said, Then you don't know about Daniel. No. Something passed across her face, not grief exactly, something harder than grief, less sentimental, the particular expression of a person reckoning up a loss and finding it is not what they thought it would be. She said, He left. His brother came to tell me an hour ago. He rode out last night for Denver. Apparently there's a woman there. She said it flat, like a fact about the weather. He didn't have the nerve to tell me himself. He sent his brother. I stood there. There wasn't much to say to that. She said, My name is Cecily Harn. My father owns the feed and grain on the corner. Cal Greer, I said. I run cattle when there's cattle to run and do whatever else needs doing in between. She looked at me. Then she looked at the people gathered in the street, who were all trying very hard to appear as though they weren't watching us, and failing at it in the way people always fail at it. She looked at them for a moment the way you look at weather, noting it, not moved by it. She said, Do you want to come inside and have some of the wedding breakfast? There's enough food to feed the territory and it's going to go to waste. I said I thought I could probably manage that. The food was good. Somebody had made biscuits that were worth making. Not the flat, hard kind you get in a hurry, but the kind somebody put time into, with a little layering to them. There were eggs and salt pork, and a jar of honey so thick it barely poured, and a woman named Maud who kept refilling my coffee without being asked, which I appreciated more than I let on. Cecily sat at the head of the long table the women had set up in the church hall. She'd taken the veil off, but she still had the dress on, and she ate with an appetite I hadn't expected, calmly, and she talked to the people who came to say things to her with a composure I didn't see very often in people who'd been handed what she'd been handed that morning. Her face was still doing what faces do when they're holding something back. There was a tightness around her eyes, but she wasn't performing sorrow for the room. She was just sitting through it, the way you sit through weather. I sat at the far end of the table and stayed out of the way. I ate 3 biscuits and 2 plates of eggs and felt something like a human being again after 3 days of trail food, and I watched the room without trying to look like I was watching it. People came and went over the next hour. The preacher made a gentle round of the room saying gentle things, and everyone received them gently. 2 women who'd been Cecily's friends since childhood, you could tell by how they touched her arm, the particular ease of it, sat with her for a while, and then left to see to their own families. An older man who had to be someone's father sat in a corner with a face like a thundercloud and drank 3 cups of coffee and said very little, and I made a note of him without knowing why. The hall emptied out slowly, the way churches do after the reason for being there is gone. People unwilling to be the first to go, and then all going at once. She came down to my end of the table when the room was mostly empty. She said, You've been very quiet. Seemed like the right call. She sat down across from me. The table was long enough that there were several feet of white tablecloth between us and empty chairs on both sides. Up close she was older than I'd first taken her for, not old, but not a girl. Maybe 32, 33. There were fine lines at the corners of her eyes from squinting into the sun, and her hands, when she folded them on the table, were the hands of a woman who worked, not the soft-palmed hands of someone who'd been kept. She said, Why did you come back, when you walked away and then turned around? I turned my coffee cup in my hands. The rim was chipped on one side, worn white where the glaze had gone. I don't know exactly, I said. Something about the way you were sitting. I wasn't sitting dramatically. No, that's sort of what it was. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, I wasn't in love with him, Daniel. I want you to know that because I think you might be wondering if I'm devastated, and I'm not. I'm angry. I'm embarrassed. She stopped and looked at the tablecloth. I'm relieved, which is the part that's going to take some working out. I said, relieved. She said, yes, and I'm not sure what to do with that. She looked up. I've spent 2 years arranging toward this. The house, the date, the dress. She glanced down at herself and something came into her face that was almost wry. The dress especially, and now it's a pile of nothing, and that's what I'm sitting in. I said, that's a hard place to sit. Yes, she looked at the table a moment. My father thinks I should be crying. My mother, she's been gone 4 years. She would have told me to eat something and think about what I actually wanted. Not what was sensible, what I actually wanted. I didn't say anything. She looked up at me. What do you actually want, Cal Greer, when you're not just passing through? It was a strange question to be asked. It wasn't a flirting question, or it didn't feel like one. It felt like genuine curiosity, the kind you only extend to someone you've decided might be worth the asking. Like she'd made a small decision about me in the time I'd been sitting at her end of the table. I said, a place that stays in one place, some land, work I can see the end of. Something that's mine. She nodded slowly, like that tracked with something she'd already suspected. She said, I have all of that. I have too much of it and not enough help with it. My father's 40 acres good for cattle, 20 more for winter wheat if somebody put the time in. She paused. He's not well. He won't say so, but I can see it. He was a strong man for a long time, and now he isn't, and he knows it, and that's its own kind of hard. I said, you're not suggesting I work for your father. She met my eyes. No, she said, I'm not suggesting that. I went back to Orver's and got Seta Rishad. Her foot was fine. Orver did good work and didn't try to charge me for more than the shoe. I stood outside on the street afterward and held the letter from Aldrin in my hand for a while. The job east of Tucson, branding season, fair pay and a place to sleep. It was a good letter. Aldrin sounded like a solid man. I put the letter back in my pocket, went to the hotel, and paid for a room for a week. I didn't have a plan. I want to be clear about that. A man who's been drifting as long as I'd been drifting doesn't make plans exactly. He makes small decisions and sees where they lead. Paying for a week at the hotel in Cutter's Creek was a small decision. The next 3 days I found work. Did a day's labor for the man who ran the livery. He had a fence line down on his south side and a nervous gelding he couldn't figure out what to do with. I fixed the fence. The gelding was a different matter, but not a mysterious one once you looked at him properly. He had a burr buried up under the saddle pad, worked in deep, and you wouldn't find it unless you were looking. Once you found it and cleared it, he was a different horse entirely. Moved easy. The livery man was surprised and showed it, which I found mildly entertaining. He paid me fair and mentioned it to his neighbor. The neighbor needed a gate mended on the north end of his property. A proper gate, not just rails, the kind with a latch mechanism that had corroded through. And I spent a day on that. By the end of the week, I'd paid for my room and had a little left and had talked to maybe a dozen men in town, and they all knew my name and what kind of work I did, and that I wasn't trouble. That's how you make a place for yourself in a place that isn't yours, slowly, usefully, without asking anything except a fair wage. I ran into Cecily on the 4th day outside the general store. She was carrying 2 bags of flour, the heavy kind, and I took one without asking, and she let me without making anything of it, and we walked the 2 blocks to her father's place, and I unloaded the sacks into the kitchen. Her father was a man named Roy Harn, the thundercloud man from the corner of the church hall, as it turned out. He was sitting in the kitchen when we came in, going over what looked like accounts, and he looked up at me over his reading spectacles with the particular expression of a man who is assessing whether you're worth the space you're taking up. I'd been assessed before. I stood still and let him do it. He was thin in the way of a man who's lost weight he didn't have to spare, not old thin but sick thin, the kind where the shirt hangs different because the shoulders under it have narrowed. His hands when he set down the pen were big and rough-knuckled, a working man's hands, but they moved a little slow. His color was off in a way I recognized, having sat with a sick man before, and his eyes were sunken but sharp. Very sharp. The kind of sharp that doesn't quit just because the body is deciding to. He shook my hand without anything extra in it, not warning me, not welcoming me, just shaking it, and said he'd heard I was good with animals. I said I'd been around them long enough. He said, the back pasture fence is down in 2 places, and I've got 20 head of cattle who have decided that's an invitation. I said I'd take a look. He said, I'm not hiring you. I said, I know, I'll take a look anyway. He watched me for another moment, then nodded once and went back to his accounts. The fence needed a half-day of work that turned into a full day, because the posts themselves were rotted at the base in 3 places I hadn't found until I started digging. And rotted posts mean the wire's been carrying the load instead of the wood, which means the wire's been stressed in ways it wasn't meant to be stressed, which means you've got 3 problems instead of 1. I fixed all of it. It was a hot afternoon, and I was tired by the end of it, and I smelled like rust and hard work, and the particular smell of turned earth that I had always liked without being able to explain why. When I came back to the house, Cecily had supper on. Nothing fancy, beans and cornbread and a piece of salt pork she'd set that morning, biscuits left from the day before, but she'd made it right, and she poured me coffee without ceremony, and her father came in from the parlor and sat and we ate. I don't know how to tell you what that was like exactly. The eating. Just that 3 people at a table, food on the plates, the particular sound of forks on china, the light coming in through the kitchen window at a flat late angle. Roy ate slowly and with concentration, the way a man eats when eating is an effort. Cecily ate efficiently, the way she did everything, and she watched the both of us without appearing to watch us. And I ate the way a man eats who hasn't eaten at a table with other people in so long he's forgotten it was a thing that happened. I'd been eating alone for a long time. Not dramatically alone, not suffering over it. Just alone. At a counter in some boarding house kitchen after the family had eaten, or on a bedroll in the dark with whatever I had. And sitting at that table in Roy Harn's kitchen felt like putting down something heavy I'd been carrying so long I'd stopped noticing the weight of it. Roy asked me over supper where I'd come from, and I told him some of it Texas originally, then New Mexico, then up into Colorado and back down, a little time in Wyoming one winter that I didn't care to repeat. He asked what I knew about winter wheat, and I told him what I knew, which was a fair amount but not everything. And he nodded and asked 1 or 2 specific questions that told me he knew more than I did on the subject, which I respected. He asked about horses, what I'd worked with, what I could do. I told him straight. He said he'd had a good horseman through here 2 years back, but the man had moved on, which was how it went. He asked me once, during that first supper, what had made me turn around. I said, beg your pardon. He said, I was watching from upstairs. You walked past the church, stopped, turned around, came back. Not many men do that. I said I didn't have a better explanation than the one I'd already given Cecily. He looked at me the way he looked at things, measuring, not unkind. He said, that's all right, some things don't explain. He went back to his beans, long as the reason was decent. I said I thought it was. He nodded, that was all he needed. After supper he went to bed early. You could see it was a habit now, not a preference, his body calling in the debt. Cecily washed the plates and I dried them without being asked, and we stood at the counter and she talked about the land. She knew it the way I knew horses, the way you know a thing you've put time into and not just observed but worked with, argued with, learned the particular moods of. The specific way the south field drains after rain. The character of the cattle they'd had, which were the ones that gave trouble and which were reliable, which of the bulls was a problem, and which one had been the best they'd ever had before he died 2 winters back. She talked about it plainly, without ornamentation, the way a person talks about a thing they know well and don't need to dress up for company. I listened. I asked 2 or 3 questions, real ones. When she got to the part about the creek that ran along the eastern border, she stopped herself and said, "You're not going to Tucson, are you?" It wasn't a question quite. I said, "The letter's still in my pocket, but no, I don't think I am." She was quiet for a moment. She folded the dish towel precisely and set it on the edge of the counter. Then she said, "I need to tell you something and I'd like you to not take it wrong." I said I'd try. She said, "I'm not looking to be saved. I'm not the woman standing in the burning building waiting for somebody to come through the window. I have a life here. I have a piece of land and a father I'm not walking away from while he's still here, and I have a way of doing things that works well enough for me. What I don't have is—" She stopped. She pressed her mouth together, choosing words. "I'm 33 years old and I almost married a man I didn't love because it seemed like the right practical move, because 40 acres is a lot to manage alone and everyone said I was being too particular, and eventually I stopped being sure they were wrong." She looked at me directly. "I think I was wrong to stop being sure." I said, "I think you probably were." She said, "I'm not asking you to marry me." I said, "I know." She said, "I'm just saying, if a man were going to stay around and work this land and sit at that table, I'd want it to be somebody I could respect, someone with some backbone and some skill and enough sense to know when to talk and when to not." She held my eyes. "Not someone I had to manage." I said, "I'm not easy to manage." Something shifted in her face. Not a smile exactly, but the shape of one held back, just the corner of her mouth. She said, "Good. I'll try to tell you the next month straight, because they were straight. Not simple, but straight." I moved out of the hotel and into Roy's barn at the start of the second week, which was Roy's idea presented as a practical matter. The barn had a tack room in the back with a cot and a small stove, and it was cheaper than the hotel and closer to the work. I didn't argue the practicalities. I paid Roy a modest amount for the room, which he accepted without discussion, and we left it there. The work was real. The kind of real that gets into your hands and your shoulders and your back and stays there. The fence repairs were just the beginning. The whole property had the feeling of a place that had been run by a strong man who'd been gradually losing his strength, so that the first priority things had been kept up and the second priority things had been let go, and now some of the second priority things were becoming first priority. I went at it in order. Fixed what was dangerous first, then what was failing, then what was just worn. Cecily worked alongside me on the things that took 2 people and handled the cattle and the house and her father on her own, and she didn't complain and she didn't expect me to keep up with her on everything, because she'd been doing this longer than I had. Roy watched from the porch on his good days. He had opinions about how the work should be done, real opinions earned from decades, and he gave them plainly when he had them, and he didn't give them when he didn't. That was a quality I appreciated. A man who only talks when he has something to say is a man worth listening to when he opens his mouth. He told me once, about 3 weeks in, that the east pasture had a particular soft spot near the creek bank that would take a horse's leg if you weren't careful, and he described exactly where it was and how deep it ran and what you could do about it and what you couldn't. I went out the next day and found it exactly where he said. That told me something about his knowledge of the land, and I filed it away. A few weeks after that he told me about the cattle, which ones had been Roy's father's stock and which ones he'd brought in himself, and what he'd been trying to breed toward. He was building toward something with that herd, a particular quality of animal for the high country, and the plan was clear in his head, even if his body was making the plan increasingly hard to execute. I listened to all of it, not just being polite, listening because it mattered, because this land and these animals were going to be my responsibility, and I wanted to understand them the way Roy understood them, and Roy was the person who could teach me. I don't think he missed what I was doing. Roy Harn was not a man who missed things. One evening in late September he came out to the barn while I was working with Seta. She'd been favoring the Rishad foot slightly, and I wanted to make sure Orver's work had held, and he stood in the door of the barn for a while watching before he said anything. He said, "You're not a young man making his start." I said, "No, sir." He said, "You've been at this a long time and you're still drifting." I said, "Was drifting? I think the word's past tense now." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "What changed?" I looked at him. He was watching me steadily, not as a challenge, just as a question that deserved a straight answer. I said, "I walked past a church, and a woman was sitting on the step." He said, "That's not much of an answer." I said, "No. But it's the true one." He looked at Seta for a moment, then back at me. He said, "She's particular, she always has been. Her mother was the same, knew her own mind, never pretended otherwise. I won't tell you that made things easy." A pause. "I'll tell you it made things real, and real is better than easy in the long run." I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "You treat her wrong, I'll make sure you regret it. I'm not well, but I'm not dead." I said, "I know you're not, and I won't." He looked at me for another long moment. Then he nodded once, the same way he'd nodded the first day, and went back to the house. October came in cold, and the work changed to winter work, the kind that's about getting the land ready for what's coming rather than getting it to produce. We brought the cattle in closer. We mended the barn roof where it had started to go. I helped Roy's neighbor, a man named Pell, bring in his winter wheat because Pell had had a bad week with his shoulder and was behind, and Pell returned the favor by lending me his post driver and his son for 2 days when I needed it. That's how a community works, the real kind. Not just neighborliness in the soft sense, but the practical economy of people who depend on each other in hard country. I've been outside of that for 11 years. Passing through means you can't receive help and you can't give it, not in the way that compounds over time. You're just a hand, temporary, and then you're gone, and the help goes with you. Nobody loses sleep over whether you made it to the next town. Nobody knows whether you did or didn't. I helped Pell again a week later when a calf of his got into trouble and he needed an extra set of hands. And then in early November when Pell's wife was sick and he was behind on his own fence work, I gave him 2 days. Not because I was keeping score. Because that was the shape of things here, the actual economy of it, and I was finally part of a place that had an economy I could be part of. There was a man in town named Cutter, no relation to the town, just a coincidence that seemed to amuse people, who ran the hardware and knew everything about everything and nothing wrong. He was about 60, compact, with the posture of a man who'd been working outdoors since he was 12, and he decided early on that I was all right. I don't know exactly what made him decide it. Maybe it was that I paid fair and on time. Maybe it was that I didn't argue about prices. Maybe it was just that I listened when he talked, and he was a man who had a lot worth listening to. He knew the water table in every field in the county and which years had been hard and why and what people had done about it. He'd been here longer than anyone except old Mrs. Devers at the hotel, and Mrs. Devers didn't talk much. I started stopping in at Cutter's place when I needed supplies, and then stopping in when I didn't need supplies but needed to know something. He always knew. He told me about the soft spot by the East Creek before I'd found it myself. Turns out Roy had told him about it years ago, and Cutter had been wondering who to pass it to. He told me about the families in the county, who was reliable and who wasn't, where the water rights disputes lay and which ones were settled, and which ones were still smoldering. Not gossip, practical geography. The kind of information that keeps a man from walking into something sideways. Staying meant something different. Staying meant you could build something that accumulated. I told Cecily that one evening at the table, not planning to, just thinking out loud, which wasn't something I did often. She listened without interrupting, and when I was done she was quiet a moment and then she said, "You're not going to go back to it. The drifting." It wasn't a question. I said no. She said, "I need you to know that I'm not keeping you here. I want to be clear about that. If you needed to go, you could go. I'm not." I said, "I know you're not holding me. That's partly why I'm not going." She looked at me for a moment, then she looked down at the table. "All right," she said quietly, and that was the end of that. There were evenings that fall that I think about still. The light going short, and the stove going for longer, and Roy would sometimes sit with us after supper before he went to bed, and we'd talk about the land, about history, about things Roy had seen in his years that neither of us had seen. He'd come out before the railroad when the territory was a different place, and he had the memories of it, the particular texture of a world that was already mostly gone. He told them well, plainly, without the sentimentality of a man who decided the past was better than the present. He just told what had happened. He told us about the winter of '76, when the snow came in October and didn't leave until April, and they'd lost a third of their cattle and nearly starved. Him and his wife and Cecily, who'd been a baby. He told it without drama, just, "Here is what happened, here is what we did, here is what we lost and what we kept." He'd built the south barn that spring, when the thaw finally came, working 16-hour days because the cattle they had left needed shelter they'd never needed before. He'd been in his 30s then. He said he'd never worked so hard in his life and never felt more himself doing it. I understood what he meant. I understood it in my body, the particular feeling of hard, necessary work, the way it burns clean. There's a kind of tiredness that comes from work that matters, and it feels different from all other tiredness. It feels earned. He told us about Cecily's mother, how he'd met her, which was not a romantic story but a practical one involving a broken wagon and a long walk, and an argument about the best way to ford the creek she'd been trying to cross alone. He disagreed with her method. She'd been right and he'd been wrong, and she had let him know it, and he had liked her immediately and permanently for that. He said she had never been wrong about something important in all the years he'd known her, and she had been wrong about small things more than anyone he'd met, and that combination was the most interesting thing a person could be. Cecily listened to her father the way you listen to someone you know is telling you things for the last time, and you don't want to be caught not listening. There was a stillness to her in those evenings that I didn't see in her during the day when she was all motion and purpose. At night, with her father talking, she was just listening, her hands still in her lap, her face quiet. I noticed that and I let her have it. Those were her evenings with her father. I was just someone in the room, keeping the stove going, which was all right and more than all right. My back went out in late October from lifting wrong, something stupid. A bale of hay I turned the wrong way, and I spent 3 days moving like an old man, which was humiliating in the way all physical weakness is humiliating to a man who's used to his body doing what he tells it. Cecily didn't say anything about it except to leave a jar of some liniment on the tack room shelf with no note. It smelled like camphor and something else I couldn't identify. It helped. I thought about that jar of liniment more than it probably deserved. She didn't ask if I needed it. She didn't make a thing of it. She just left it. Roy had a bad spell at the end of October, his worst yet. The doctor came out from town and spent an hour with him, and then came to find me in the barn, which told me something about what had been established in the doctor's mind about who to talk to. He was a young doctor, careful, and he explained what was happening to Roy's heart in plain language, and told me what to watch for and what to do when it happened. He said Roy had maybe until spring if they were lucky, maybe less. I said we'd manage. He said he's a stubborn man. I said yes, sir. He said, in this case, that's probably what's kept him this long. After the doctor left, I went and told Cecily. We were standing in the kitchen and I told her what the doctor had said, and she stood there and took it in, and then she turned to the stove and started doing something with the dishes that didn't need doing, just keeping her hands busy while she thought about it. I stood and let her. After a few minutes she said, "All right," quietly. Just that. Then she turned around and said, "I'd like him to have as good a winter as we can give him." I said, "That's what we'll do." She looked at me for a moment. Not gratitude exactly. Something more solid than gratitude. Something that acknowledged we were both in it together, and that was the shape of things. We moved Roy's chair closer to the stove that week. I repaired the gap in the south wall of the house where the wind was getting in through a crack I'd been meaning to get to. Small things. The things that were in my power. That was what there was to do, and I did them. Roy died the following March. I won't go into all of it except to say it was the way he'd have wanted in the house, in his own bed, with his daughter beside him and a man in the next room who he trusted. The doctor came out and said his heart had simply given out, which was accurate as far as it went. What it didn't say was that Roy Harn had worked his entire life without complaint, and had stayed present in his own life long past when a lesser man would have withdrawn from it, and that what gave out at the end was not something that had failed. It was something that had lasted exactly as long as it could with everything Roy had asked of it. I dug the grave myself. He'd wanted to be on the property, on the rise at the east end of the north field where he went to think in the years before thinking became difficult, and the ground in March was still half frozen at depth, and it was the hardest digging I'd ever done. I did it in shifts over 2 days. Cecily came out the second morning and worked beside me for a while without saying anything, and then we finished it together, and that was what it was. We buried him on a Wednesday. The preacher and 2 of Roy's oldest friends from town, men in their 60s who'd known him 30 years, and Cecily and me. Not a large service. Roy hadn't wanted large. The preacher said the right things and Cecily stood straight throughout, and I stood at her shoulder and we put him in the ground and covered him over, and that was the end of Roy Harn. Afterward I stood at the grave for a while after the others went back to the house. The field around me was brown and flat, and the sky was high and pale, and the wind was coming from the north with a thin cutting edge to it, the last of winter. I was tired in the specific way you're tired after doing something that mattered, not in the muscles, exactly, but deeper. The preacher came back out and stood beside me. We stayed that way for a while without talking. He was an older man, patient, and he didn't seem to need me to say anything. After a while he said, "Roy liked you. He told me that a few months back. He said he liked that you didn't explain yourself too much." I said, "I never had much that needed explaining." He said you worked like a man who knew what he was doing and you didn't need to be told twice, and you were straight with him when he asked you something direct. He said he trusted you." He paused. He also said he was glad Cecily had found someone with some spine. He used a different word, but that's the polite version. I said, "Roy wasn't much for polite versions." The preacher smiled, said, "No, he was not." He was quiet another moment. Then, he told me once that the hardest thing about getting sick was watching Cecily carry more than she ought to. He said she never complained, which was the thing that made it hardest because he'd raised her not to, and he was proud of it and sorry for it at the same time. He looked at the grave. He said having you here made that better. He said he could sleep at night. I didn't say anything. The wind came again from the north and I turned up my collar. The preacher said, "That's a good thing to leave a man. The peace of knowing someone decent is going to look after what he loved." He shook my hand and walked back toward the house, and I stood alone at Roy's grave in the cold March wind for a while longer, and I thought about 11 years of being nobody's peace of mind, and what it meant to be that for somebody at the end. What it meant that he'd said it. That was the moment it finished settling, I think. The thing I'd been deciding since I'd walked back toward that church step. Roy Harn had trusted me with what he loved, and he'd said so, and that went into me somewhere and stayed. After Roy was gone, the property was Cecily's outright, which she'd known it would be and had made her peace with long before. She was matter-of-fact about it the way she was matter-of-fact about most things. It was real, it was hers. There was work to be done. We went on working. The spring came in slow, and then all at once the way it does in that country. And with it came the particular work of spring, calving, the first fence checks after the frost heave, clearing the drainage channel along the south field that always silted up over winter. I was up before light most mornings and out late most evenings, and I was tired in a way that felt right, the way you're tired when the tiredness has a point to it. Cecily worked her own hours, and they were long. She was a better hand with the cattle than I was, and she knew it, and I knew it, and neither of us made anything of it. She'd grown up with those animals. She knew them. I was still learning them, and I learned them through her, watching how she moved around them, what she read in their eyes and ears and the particular way they stood. There were mornings I'd find her out with the cattle before I'd gotten to the barn, already knowing something I hadn't thought to check yet. She'd be back at the house by the time I got there, starting breakfast, and she'd say something like, "The gray heifer's going to drop today," and she'd be right. I asked her once how she knew, and she said, "I just looked at her." I knew what she meant. It's the same thing with horses. You look at them long enough and you start reading a language you can't translate exactly, but you understand. We didn't talk about what we were doing, what we were building. Neither of us were people who talked about things we were in the middle of doing. That felt right too. In April she asked me once, at the end of a long day, what I wanted to do with the winter wheat field. Not what Roy had wanted or what made economic sense, but what I wanted, what I thought was the best use of it. I told her what I thought, which was a rotation plan that would take 3 years to fully establish but would leave the field in better shape than it was now. She listened and asked a few questions that were good questions, better than mine, and we talked about it for about an hour, and by the end we had a plan that was better than what either of us had walked in with. After we'd worked it out, she was quiet a moment, and then she said, "My father would have liked that plan." I said, "I got part of it from what he told me about that field." She looked at me, then she looked away. She said, "I know," quietly, and that was all. The spring calving was harder than we'd expected. 3 difficult births in 10 days, including one that cost us the calf and nearly cost us the cow. And Cecily and I were both up through several nights, running on short sleep and black coffee. The 3rd birth was the worst, a breech that we'd been watching for hours, and when it finally came, we were both in the stall at 2 in the morning, knees in the straw, and she worked that calf out with her sleeves rolled up and her jaw set the way it got when she was concentrating on something that mattered, and I helped where I could and stayed out of the way where I couldn't, which is the skill that matters in that situation. The cow lived and the calf lived, and they were both on their feet by dawn, and we came back into the house, and she washed her arms at the basin, and I put the kettle on without being asked, and we sat at the table in the early gray light and drank coffee without saying much. She said after a while, "I used to do that alone." I said, "Harder alone." She said, "A lot harder." She looked at her coffee. I didn't realize how much harder until it wasn't. I didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything to add to it. By midsummer, the cattle were in good condition and the wheat field was planted and coming in the way we'd hoped, and I had the sense I hadn't had in 11 years, the particular sense of a man who can see the shape of the next season and the one after that and the one after that, who can see far enough ahead to plan. You can't plan when you're drifting. You can only react. And planning, I had forgotten, was one of the better things a man could do. To look at a piece of land and think, in 3 years this is going to be this. To plant something you won't harvest for a season, and trust that you'll be there when the harvest comes. The night I want to tell you about is in November of that year. Late November, the first real cold snap, the kind where the temperature drops fast at sundown, and by full dark it's serious cold with a wind that finds every gap. I was in the barn finishing up Seta, and their 2 horses, and a mule named Chester who had firm opinions about being stabled and made them known. I'd got them all settled finally, Chester laughed and reluctantly. And when I came out, the sky was the kind of black that means hard, cold, and clear, no cloud. Just stars all the way to the ground on every horizon. So many you couldn't count them and couldn't find the dark between them. The kind of sky that makes you feel small in a way that isn't bad, just true. That puts the right size on things. The kitchen light was on. I stood outside for a minute. The cold was on my face and my breath was showing and the wind had stopped, which happens sometimes at the worst cold, the air just going still and freezing in place. And I stood there in that cold and quiet and looked at the light in the kitchen window and thought, this is what it is. This is the thing I didn't know I was looking for the whole time I was looking. She was at the stove when I came in, heating soup. She turned around when she heard the door and she said, "There's soup." And I said, "Good." And she ladled it out and set it on the table and I sat down. I didn't take my coat off right away because I was still cold from outside. And she sat across from me and looked at me for a moment. She said, "What?" I said, "Nothing, just this." She looked at the table, the bowl, the window showing nothing but dark and the reflection of the lamp. She said, "Is it enough for a man like you?" I said, "What do you mean, a man like you?" She said, "A man who's been everywhere." I thought about how to say it, then I said, "I've been everywhere. It all looked like nowhere to me. This looks like somewhere." She was quiet for a long moment. The stove ticked. The cold pressed against the windows from outside like a weight. Then she put her hand on the table, not reaching for me, just setting it there, open, palm up, the way you set down something you've decided to put down. And I put mine over it. Her hand was warm from the stove and mine was cold from outside, and we sat like that without talking, the soup cooling and the stove ticking and the dark outside absolute and complete. She looked at me, not with the look of someone deciding something she decided. This was just looking, the particular way a person looks at something they know is theirs and are glad of it. That was the moment. There wasn't a speech. There didn't need to be. It was a hand on a table and another hand over it, and everything that needed saying was already in the room. We married in June. Same church, same preacher, different morning, a Tuesday, because Cecily said weekends were for working, and I agreed with her. The bell tower still had the morning glories or new ones that looked the same. The preacher said the words and we said them back, and the light in the church was the soft early morning light, and it was a small wedding. Just a few of the people in town we'd come to know, and 2 of Cecily's cousins down from the north who I was meeting for the first time. Afterward, she took my arm going out of the church, and we stood in the sun for a minute on the front step. The same step she'd been sitting on that first morning when I'd walked past and turned around. She looked at me. The morning glories were open above us in the bell tower, the particular blue of them, and the street below was starting its day. She said, "You know this doesn't make you any easier to live with." I said, "No, I imagine not." She said, "Good." And I put my hand over hers on my arm, and we walked back down the street toward home, and the light came at a long angle through the dust, and it was already warm. The land is mine now in a way I don't have proper words for, not because my name is on the deed, though it is. Because I know where the fence goes soft in spring, and I know which of our horses will test you on a Monday morning if you don't pay attention, and I know which field takes water and which one doesn't, and I know every sound the house makes at night. What's the board settling and what's the wind, and what's something worth getting up for. I know it the way a man knows a thing he's worked for and will go on working for. And I know that she knows me, not the idea of me, not some version of what was useful or available. Me, the man who walked back toward that church step when he should have kept going, who dried dishes without being asked in a house where he was still a stranger, who sat up with her father in the hard months because it was the right thing, and Roy Harn was worth sitting up for. That man, she chose that man. I still have the letter from Aldrin in a tin on the shelf in the barn. The job east of Tucson, the branding season, the fair pay. Some nights I think about showing it to Cecily, but I never do. It's just a letter. The road I didn't take. It doesn't need more attention than that. Tonight there's a light in the kitchen and soup on the stove, and Chester has his customary opinions about being stabled, and Seta needs looking at in the morning because she's been off her feed, and I want to find the reason before it becomes a reason I can't fix. Tomorrow, there's fence work on the east side, and the winter wheat rotation to think about, and the whole long winter out ahead of us. A place that stays in one place. Work I can see the end of. Something that's mine. I stopped looking at the sky a long time ago.